I'll just get started. So tomorrow, I'll have office hours in the design studio. I'll bring food, but try to work collaboratively during these because I don't have the answer to everything, obviously. But this is a good space for you guys to get together and talk about the past exam. And then just make sure if you're taking an alternate final exam, you know the time and location of yours. It's sent separately. And then the actual final exam is Saturday the 11th from 2 to 5 p.m. right here. Okay, so the first lecture is lecture 5, which is the somatosensory system. And basically he talks about the sense of touch during this one. So why is the somatosensory system really important? It's because the sense of touch really helps us navigate the world. And there are a lot of people in this world who don't have all senses working, so this is actually very, very important. And he talks about, first he prefaces with a little bit of an anatomical picture, which is on the left, and then on the right he talks about how there's a mapping. So I think the important part to take away from this is that the dermatome means that it's mapped from the spinal cord to your body. So therefore, if you have a spinal cord injury, the higher you go, the more loss of function you have. And then he talks about the somatosensory modalities, and there are many of them, but the primary ones are touch, pain, temperature, and itch. And within those, there are subcategories. And the importance of knowing the subcategories is that there are different receptors and fibers associated with each modality, and that comes into play when he starts talking about the Pacinian corpuscles and the Merkel cells and things like that. And then, so now we talk about the mechanoreceptors, which allow you to have those somatosensory modalities that I put in the slide before. This is a quick, slice through your skin to see the morphologically distinct mechanoreceptors. Starting at the top or closest to the surface of your skin, which is the epidermis, you'll see the Meissner corpuscles and the Merkel cells, the Rossini endings, and the Pacinian corpuscles. And the importance of having them layer by layer comes into play a little bit later when he talks about how you can sense the different modalities. And then on the right, this is also very important because you need to know that the different receptors have different receptive field sizes, and that plays into what modality they're actually in. So instead of hardcore memorizing each of the different receptors, it's actually important to kind of link them to how big is the receptive field, and what does that play into what modality that you can actually sense. And so image B plays into that, which is resolution of touch, and then image C actually determines sensitivity and determination of texture, which he talks about a little bit later. Cool, and this I just put on for reference, just in case you were going through everything and then wanted to tag back and look at specific things. Cool, so the first modality he talks about is vibrations. And so this is through the Pacinian corpuscles, which are shown here. I put the details in the bullet points, but basically the tip of the axon is at the center of the Pacinian, is very sensitive to quick and short movements. As you remember from the previous slides, the Pacinians are very far into your body, skin. They're not close to the surface, is what I'm trying to say. And so basically when you have that, if you have vibrations, because it has that particular frequency where you see that dip in that graph, you're actually able to sense vibrations and flutters. Does that make sense?
Is there a difference between vibration and flutter?
For the purposes of this class, I wouldn't differentiate too much, but basically it's just a high frequency touch or sense of touch. So somatic sensory afferents or receptor endings on peripheral afferents. So basically he talks about how each of your receptors is mapped to a different fiber, and the importance of these fibers is their size. And so you learn this in lab, you probably learned this a million times now, but thicker fibers have action potentials that travel a little bit faster than thin fibers. And so therefore, which fibers, that is cut off for sure. That's okay. So which fibers are associated with which receptors basically determines how fast you can sense that modality. So I think the example he gives in class is if you were to step into a super hot pot of water, because I don't know why. But what you would feel first is you would feel the water first before you sense pain from the heat, and that's because of the fiber size that's associated with these particular receptors. And then afferent nerves, I think I'm probably just going to skip through this because all the details are in the bullet points, but you've learned this in other classes in SP Lab. And so the next type of, I guess, sense of touch that he talks about is form and texture processing, which is very important because a lot of times when people, like this is how Braille works, like why people are able to sense those letters. And so it's really dependent on receptive field and 2-point discrimination threshold. So the smaller your receptive field, the increased sensitivity. Again, you've learned this previously before. And then form and texture perception depend on spatial codes, and form processing is based on spatial processing due to activity across the population. So that's referring to this bottom image where all the different dots are receptors. And so therefore, if you had a letter A basically like raised off of the page and you were to like run your finger over it, what's happening is that you get those activated receptors like where the page is raised up. And so he talks about like this experiment where you're able to like, I guess like show the different receptors, the SA and the RA, and then you can see that those SA ones are particularly sensitive to spatial codes, and so you get higher resolution there. And again, that corresponds to the Merkle discs and the Lorentz image, which is exactly the same thing. You just get higher resolution there, and that's what allows you to actually sense like texture and form. Okay, so then he talks about a couple of experiments. A couple of experiments where he correlates dot size and perceived roughness. And again, I think these are pretty self-explanatory. This bottom graph talks about different size dots and how you're able to perceive roughness based on that. And then same with those two images. And again, what's important is it links back to the Merkle cells. Does that make sense? So, quick recap before I move on. So the Merkle cells are the ones that relate to form and texture processing, but which ones are the ones that relate to vibration? Can somebody yell it out? Okay, exactly. And then so we move on to cortical representation. You're moving past just like receiving the information from the outside world. You're moving into, okay, like now how do you process the information? How does it send that to your brain? So basically, okay, maybe it's not. Never mind. Fun fact, I guess, proprioceptive pathways for the upper and lower body. And then basically, we talk about this a lot with all the different systems where you have like the mapping. So particular part of your body mapped to a particular cortical region. Same thing with the somatosensory system. So what he shows you here is like a slice of the cortical region where you can see the different parts of the body and the different colors mapped directly to the cortical region. So you have this like the order. And then the homunculus really shows you like what is more sensitive. So like what you would have, I guess, higher resolution of sense of touch. So your fingers are very sensitive, and so your receptive field is very. Moving on, and then we talked about plasticity. So this is important, piggybacking off of this cortical mapping, because plasticity is basically long-lasting modifications in neuronal response that accompany changes in environmental stimuli. And so you will actually see topographic changes in sensory representations after like serious injury. For example, amputation, which I'll get to on the next slide. And so plasticity is important in response to injury, like amputation, but also in normal learning. So cortical plasticity is basically the basis of how you guys learn. And so what happens when something is amputated? So they do this in the owl monkey where they amputate every digit, which is not great, but what you see in the left bottom image is that you lose that red part, meaning that after you amputated that digit, the other digits actually take over the area. And so that's important in the right image because you have a phantom limb. So let's say you had an arm amputated and then you felt like an itch in the arm that was amputated. Well, now you can actually like itch your face. He talks about this in class in order to alleviate that feeling because of this overtaking of areas in the cortical region. Cool. So moving on to the next lecture. Does anyone have questions about the previous one? Yes.
So if you lose the cortical
representation, like an amputation case, how would you even feel an itch in that arm in the first place?
So I think it's because you get that, I don't know specifically, and I will double check for you after this, but I think it's because like in your brain, like, you still have some perception of like you have like the limb there, and so you'll still feel like it's present, but to alleviate that, it's like, it's already been mapped to a different region.
Steve, Shamir also talked a lot about that, and I think it's because like your body or like your brain gets really confused when it tries to send a motor signal to the missing limb, and so like it doesn't understand where it's not getting feedback from that limb that the signal can receive because it's not there anymore. So that causes like a itchy or like painful sensation somehow.
So like it hasn't completely been replaced, that it's like gone, and then small. Make sense? Thank you. Yes.
Something about like slow adapting versus
Yeah.
rapidly adapting. I think.
Yeah, let me talk about that again. Here, right? So you have like the slow adapting and the rapidly adapting. So the biggest difference is with the rapidly adapting, actually, sorry.
Just to confirm, those are the receptors and not the fibers, right? Like
Yeah.
when you define it as rapidly adapting versus slowly adapting, like we're talking about the actual mechanoreceptors and not the fibers that are connected to it.
Yeah, so you're talking about the receptors, but each receptor is like linked to a specific fiber. So it's like,
So is it slowly adapting fibers or slowly adapting mechanoreceptors?
so I think they're like, they work in like in a system. So both of them have to like have the same response in order to have the correct neuronal function. Yeah. So basically with the rapid adapting and slow adapting, turn your attention to figure C where you see the different firing patterns. That is like what is different about them. And so because you have the slow adapting continues to fire over time, that's why it's able to sense texture. Because you continuously like have feedback, whereas the rapidly adapting ones, you lose that, so it's not going to sense texture. That's going to sense just more like a general.
So slowly adapting is like the last three because there's like a continued firing after, or slowly adapting.
So when in his slides, when he talks about slowly adapting, he's specifically talking about the second column. But because the Ruffini endings, which he doesn't really go into detail about, also has that pattern of firing, it will be more likely that it senses like texture and form versus anything else. Yeah.
So like when the like other like areas take over the cortical lamina region, does their receptive field change or do they become more sensitive?
I don't think so necessarily, but I will double check. Okay, so we'll move on, and if you have more questions later. Okay. So lecture 6 is speech and vocal processing. So the primary question that he wants to answer during this lecture is, how does the auditory system process speech? What do we want to know about hearing? Where does the sound come from? What does it mean, and who is talking? And so just a quick anatomical overview. The part that he really focuses on, you guys don't have to memorize all these parts, but basically think about the importance of the vocal fold, and that's what he details. The vocal fold is important because it produces these audible pulses, which I'll go into in a few slides after this. But basically what it does is it produces the vibration to determine the pitch we make, and that helps you actually differentiate between a male and a female voice. Or like produce a higher pitch or a lower pitch voice. So let's see. So the source filter model of speech production is what he goes into next, which feeds directly from that anatomical overview because that pitch column with the glottal pulses, that's directly from the vocal fold. So comparing the top row of that top image to the bottom row, you're producing exactly the same vowel or the same sound, but one's at a lower pitch, the top one's at a lower pitch, and the bottom one's at a higher pitch. And so that would be like a male voice and a female voice, which is what he focuses on in his lecture. So it's the exact same thing, but because of the glottal pulses in the vocal fold, you're actually able to have a higher pitch voice or a lower pitch voice. And so So the rest of this, he kind of talks about moving from column 1 to 2 to 3 is how you have vocal tract filtering, which gives rise to the envelope, which is in the middle. And then you get the speech signal, which you guys are familiar with because of SVD Lab, where you get all those different formants and you're actually able to like code them. And then the bottom image I just included because that pathway anatomically is like that vocal tract filtering. So as air is pushed through that system, that's what's giving you that envelope in this speech signal.
Could you go back? For the glottal pulse, like I'm a little confused about how you get frequency, like it says that like pitch comes from that chart. Like how do you read pitch from that?
Can you speak up a little?
Yeah.
Sorry?
How do you read pitch from like the glottal pulse graph? Like I don't really understand.
So this will be directly related to that F naught thing.
Oh, okay.
So that's the frequency. Yeah. And then, so I guess further answer this question, this is like what you would do with pitch. So if you were to use that spectrogram, which it's called, you would be able to determine the one is from there and the is from there. And I just included this for reference. Okay, so moving past, I guess, like initial anatomical stuff, what's the auditory nerve or, yeah, and cortical response? So basically, if you see on the left, that's the sound that they're feeding in, and then in response, on the right is the firing rate, and you see that it matches up and that's kind of what he's going for.
I think there are 2 questions here.
Where? Oh, yes. Sorry.
On the the second previous slide, for the envelope, is that just like the relative amplitude of the different
Yes.
frequencies of concussion?
And that's like what Talat talks about in his SVD lab stuff, is that if you have the envelope, it's like enough to recognize like speech. And so that's what the nuclear implant does. Yes.
What is the envelope?
It's what he just said. Wait, can you say it again?
I don't know if that's, I was like exactly right there.
No, you're
So-
correct.
Okay, so it's just the relative amplitude of the different frequencies over time.
Yep.
Should you just like draw a line over the heat?
Yes.
On the next slide, so in this case, like based on that graph, like the pitch there would be like the male, or I guess the male voice, because like you look at the first line, I guess, and that's F naught, so that gives you the idea of what that like pitch is, and then the formants are just like scalar multiples of that.
So the formants will be what determines what vowel you're saying. So
Okay.
that's like with SVD lab with like F1 and F2. Basically, if you have F1 and F2, you can identify like what vowel you're trying to produce. And so that's specific to what you're trying to say, or like a specific feature. Yes.
So on the practice exams, there's a question that are like 2 people singing same pitch with different vowels. You don't try before. That like and like draw the frequency thing on that, whatever. So we draw the same like frequency of bars, but a different sine wave that they
So,
different format.
so you're supposed to draw them singing the same thing, but it's a male and a female?
No, it's 2 people are singing, I think, and they're singing the same frequency, same pitch, but different vowels.
Oh, yeah. Then you would have the different formats.
Okay.
So your graph on the rightmost would have different peaks.
But same frequency of bars.
Yes, if it's the same person. Yep. Okay, so, oh, and then he does this like little primate example with an experiment, and basically you can see that there's a pitch center, so if you play like different pitches, well, those particular cortical regions are activated. And then, so with categorical perception of speech, I'm sure you guys are also familiar with this, but just to drive in one more time, basically you have that identification task, and then you get that sharp transition because you have categorical perception. What's a little bit different here is that from da to ta, the only difference is that you have a different voice onset time, and so what they do here on the x-axis is they like change the voice onset time like very slightly to be able to test categorical perception. Okay, so speech acquisition and language learning. So the top is just like a quick timeline of how you guys learn speech. from age 0 to 12 months. And the two important things I think are that speech is broken into two components, and so it's really production and perception. And then the bottom image basically shows that the older you are when you learn or acquire a second language, the less proficient you're probably going to end up being. And then there's a little bit of experimentation with categorical perception and perceptual magnet effects. And with this, I actually went to the paper and actually included a little bit more detail, so I don't want to read that directly to you, but take a look at it, it's pretty cool. With early speech learning, the top graph shows you that as you get older, you remember this like graph with like the little bubbles from SPG lab, right? That's unfortunate. But basically what ends up happening is that your specific vowels and sounds change a little bit as you get older, which makes sense. And then the bottom graph, you have the solid dots and then the open dots. And so the solid dots actually represent like moms speaking to their children. And then the open symbols actually represent moms speaking to other adults. And so I thought it was really cool with like early learning. It's like when you like hear parents like speaking to their kids, they like baby talk. This is exactly what it's talking about. Why they do that is that they exaggerate their speech, and so therefore you can see that they're concentrated in one area so that the kids can learn better. I thought that was pretty cool. Yes?
I think there are some questions about like anatomy that accounts for like access reduction. Is that like more, is that being answered by like these studies, or is that more like we have to look in the anatomy section for those answers?
For accent production?
Yeah, like if two people say the same vowel and they sound different, like what component would like generate an accent for someone?
Oh, yeah. So I guess that kind of plays into this, where he talks about the two different vowels there, and if you listen to his lecture when he says them, they like sound pretty similar. So I think that was like on purpose, like for this study, and so I would go back to this and check this out. But yeah, it would be like a slightly different production of sound in terms of going through the speech track. Yes.
So on this previous slide before, where they're talking about like the as an infant, like you're like learning like perception versus production. It says that like infants like they can't tell the difference between like different languages like early on, but then the graph afterwards shows that there's like a can you go back one more? Yeah, so this one is saying that like infants are able to kind of tell the difference between the American pronunciation versus the Swedish pronunciation. The slide before that, it says that like infant can discriminate phonetic contrast of all languages. I was just confused because like isn't it saying that like infants can't tell the difference between like there's no difference in terms of like language specific vowels and language specific sounds to an infant?
I think you're wrong, but I think the graph on the next slide, he said it's like 6 months of development, so by the time they can language, I think.
So they're old enough to that
So
point
they're
to
old
the
enough,
same
yeah.
So it'd be like on like that side of the graph versus that side of the graph, and that's mapped to this particular. But I can clarify, double check afterwards. Yeah. Cool, I'm gonna move on. So the next thing he talks about is the Lombard effect, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, because if you go to a party, you like better talk a little bit louder in the presence of background noise. And so he does an experiment, well, he doesn't specifically do an experiment, but there's an experiment with marmosets, and basically they exhibit the Lombard effect in the presence of background noise. So basically the important part to pull from here is that the blue graph, the blue line and the red line don't overlay. And so basically in the presence of background noise, you see that they speak at a, or like they communicate at a louder volume. So moving on, the next question he wants to answer is, why do our voices sound different on tape? And so this is kind of mapping back to like every time you listen to yourself in a recording, you're kind of like a little bit shook because you're like, oh my god, I like sound awful. Well, this is why. So here's representations of language in the brain anatomically. On the right was an experiment where he talks about basically like focusing on the middle two when you're hearing yourself speak, when the person is hearing him or herself speak, you actually get like less activity. So it seems like reduced, and he'll show you why. So the first panel on the left basically talks about how when you vocalize yourself and you hear yourself or you're actually speaking, there's actually a group of neurons that inhibits their firing, and so that's why you see that empty space right in the middle. In the middle panel, there are actually some neurons that also show excitation during vocalization, so there's two primary populations that he talks about. And then on the rightmost panel, he shows the temporal relationship of these two populations of neurons. So basically, when you start vocalizing, the inhibition actually begins before that vocal onset. And then the excitation begins after the vocal onset. And so you can see how he like marks them on the graph. And then moving on, there's an experiment with human auditory cortex, which shows again that reduced activity during speaking. And so what's important to note is that when you compare listening versus speaking, the lines like also again do not overlay, because when you are speaking, you don't see the same peaks because there's less activity. Okay, so kind of packed a lot in this slide, but bear with me. So why exactly does speaking or vocalizing suppress or modulate neural activity in the auditory cortex? The hypothesis that he poses you guys with is for the purpose of vocal control and learning, and so in humans, vocal feedback control, the humans will actually compensate for this. So this is an experiment that he talks about. Basically, humans are told to, or like in this experiment, they're told to vocalize something or like speak, and they're told to whisper as well. And this is also important because when you whisper, you don't actually have the movement of your bones as much, so they're trying to eliminate that factor and control the experiment a little bit more. But what they do is when they whisper this, they take that and then they modulate it and they change it and then feed back to the person. So instead of hearing exactly what they said out loud, they're hearing something that the experimenters changed. And so what they see is that humans will actually try to compensate for that, and what ends up happening is that you see an altered feedback changes in vocal suppression in the auditory cortex, and that's detailed on the right graph, where you see the middle graph actually has the red and blue matching up because the excitation population of neurons is not changing. What's changing is the suppressed neurons now no longer overlay on each other, so you have a different response there based on this different feedback. That was a lot, sorry. Does that make sense? Yes.
So do they suppress the auditory cortex less? Do they suppress it more?
I just need to double check. They suppress it less, yeah. So that's a red line, it's like above, so it has a higher firing. Yes.
In the slide in the one before, what region is the excitatory, so the ones that exhibit like the excitatory response when you're speaking, like what does that correspond to?
Still auditory cortex, but I don't think that's reasonable.
Okay.
I can look for a more specific answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
What change did they make on the feedback?
So I actually didn't include that picture, but there's one slide that's completely black and white, and it has this like person wearing headphones. This is not very great, but like it's that one where you can see like the graph of like how they compensate. So just for reference, but I can like answer that later.
They shift the formants. They shift the formants.
Okay.
The person speaks, they shift the formants.
Did you hear him?
So I'm lost in the concept. So we hear ourselves differently because our auditory cortex is suppressed when we speak, not because it transfers to the bone.
So I have a punchline here, so incredible. I guess I'll get to that now. So basically then he talks about these two different feedback loops. That was crazy. But that's okay. In the leftmost one I highlighted in that blue with the external sounds. That's what they're doing with experimentation. They're introducing, instead of letting yourself hear your own vocalization, they're introducing fun modulated sound. And then so you see the X's, you choose all of that function, and then what's normal is not right. And then the punchline really is that why do voices sound different on tape? It's because there's only air conduction, no bone conduction, and then vocal production system modulates auditory cortex during speech. So it's a two-part, two-pronged thing. And one refers to like if you were like watching a movie, basically, like you're not speaking during it, so your bones aren't like going crazy. Cool. Yes.
On the most recent Coasted Back test, there was a question about 3 possible reasons why, like, if you sing out of tune, you don't notice it. So
Okay.
I know these are only 2 that got covered in lecture, but I was wondering if there's like a secret third one.
Well, there's a secret one. I don't know it, but I can look for one. Yeah. Good question. Yes.
Can you say something about like perfect pitch towards the end of I think his lecture?
Yes. He talks about music.
So would that be the secret third one to answer the back test?
I don't want to give a hard yes or no yet because I need to double check, but I'll look into it. Okay, amazing. So whoever came to this section on Thursday or whenever it was, these are like the exact same slides that I presented, so bear with me, I'm very sorry. But in this one, he talks about the cochlear implant, which is all your guys' favorite topic, because of that class. So the biggest problem there is a huge problem with audition is deafness and hearing loss. And so hearing loss is a huge population, and if it affects children, it actually leads to a lot of horrible downstream effects. And so it's very important to think about technology like the cochlear implant, which has been the most successful neuroprosthesis device to restore hearing. And it's surgically implanted electronic device that restores hearing by electrically stimulating remaining nerve endings in the cochlea. And so on the right, I provided an image of how the cochlear implant would fit in anatomically. So moving forward, the audiogram of a potential CI user, what I shaded in yellow is your normal range, or your fun little speech banana, as some would call it. And then the bottom gray is like somebody who might need a cochlear implant. Okay. So I'm not going to read through all this because it's going to bore you guys, but basically just have a good understanding of how the signal is sent through your cochlear implant. It's very general here. But one thing that I would, I guess, direct your attention to is that something that's cool and important is that you don't actually need to puncture the skin, and so that's good because in terms of insertion and actually implementing the device, it makes it a lot easier. And another thing to note is what I put in red. The cochlear implant works because the cochlea is tunatopically organized, and you better know that by now because you've drilled it into your guys' heads. So a little histopathology of the cochlea. You just take a look at the pictures. He outlines the inner hair cells and the outer hair cells, and then shows a little bit of a cartoon of like what happens with hearing loss. So you're losing those hair cells and you're losing some of your auditory nerve fiber endings. So the top cartoon graph picture is normal, and then the bottom is what actually repaired. Cool. So what the cochlear implant really does is it stimulates these remaining nerve endings because you lost the hair cells when you made something connect. Cool. So there's a couple technical challenges of a cochlear implant. And one big thing is to think about physically the cochlea is coiled, so the implant has to be designed appropriately. So how do you insert it without damaging the remaining nerve endings, because obviously that's what you're trying to connect. And how do you stimulate fibers in the apex where the electrode won't reach. And so electrodes technically cannot be inserted all the way in, and so the most apical fibers or your low frequencies can't be stimulated. So now you're thinking about, okay, am I losing those frequencies, or like how can I make this work for people so they can hear like the full range of frequencies. And then the electrodes are also embedded in a very conductive friendly chamber because the inside of your body isn't dry. And so therefore it causes interactions between the electrodes because obviously you need like electrical stimulation, and so this limits to 8 independent electrodes. Yes.
So that's a lot when we're talking about the electrodes can reach the
So I think it's like both are correct. I guess it depends like how like far into what the apex you're talking about, and also like what technology, because there's like so many different types. So I think these two like statements are pulled from different contexts. Okay, so what makes it really hard to design a cochlear implant also is that sounds are complex in time and frequency. So you guys know that there's like a million different things that are coded within sound, and so to be able to take that from the outside world and transmit it to somebody's brain, kind of a wild concept. One of the older strategies is the compressed analog strategy, and I'll let you guys redo that by yourself. It's not as important as the current implant, which is the continuous interleaved sampling system. And so basically it has a bank of bandpass filters to do a tonotopic analysis of the speech. And it has a rectification to extract the envelope of the signals from the filters. And again, that's what we talked about with the envelope being enough for them to, I guess, somewhat perceive speech. And then compression is done in mapping the envelope to the pulse amplitudes. And so the important part about this current technology is what they end up doing is it's non-simultaneous. So that helps reduce the electric interaction problem. There's a visual in his slide that I did not put here because it's giant, but that it basically shows that last bullet point. Okay, so how well do cochlear implants actually work? The cochlear implant processing of speech lacks frequency information because, as you can tell from comparing these two colored images, you lose a lot of that fluctuation, that's your frequency information. And CI users do not necessarily always have access to low frequencies. And then there's also a wide range of performance across CI users. So that's what the right visual is showing you, is that even if you're getting the exact same implant as the person next to you, you might have the same level of hearing loss. There's actually such a spread of how people are able to cope with the implant and whether or not it helps them regain hearing. So studying the auditory cortex, the physiology of it, basically. So let me quickly overview what he does with these experiments, is that he takes a marmoset, he puts some drops into one of its ears, it goes deaf in one ear. Oh no. But it's good for science because you can acoustically stimulate one side and you can electrically stimulate the other side. And so it's really cool because then when you look at like the brain and how it maps to the cortical region, you're actually able to see how an acoustic stimulation versus an electrical stimulation affects the different populations of neurons. And then so this image are the results from that previous experiment where you stimulate with acoustic and then you also stimulate electrically. And what you can see from acoustic stimulation is that all the colored dots are like firing neurons, which is great. So you're getting a lot of that activity. And then with the cochlear implant, when you do the electrical stimulation, you see a lot of black dots, meaning that they're not stimulated. So even though you're able to hear and perceive speech, you're losing a lot of information. And that's because there's two primary populations of neurons again. So if I focus your attention on the right panel, basically the V-shaped neurons, you can see that the cochlear implant does a pretty good job of activating them. So you see a pretty good mapping between, okay, like you put in the sound and you get a correct response. But then when you look at the O-shaped neurons, you get a response on the top with the normal acoustic response, but with the cochlear implant, you completely lose that information. And that's because the O-shaped neurons are very, very finely tuned. And so that's what this image shows you, where the O-shaped neurons actually have like a very much like smaller and like finely tuned to specific frequencies, if that makes sense. And then that's also partially because the O-shaped neurons show inhibition at higher sound levels. So again, that's part of it being like very finely tuned. Okay, so the next couple slides, I didn't want to regurgitate onto my slides because basically it's just a ton of bullet points that he puts there. And I think if you read through them, you'll be able to get a really good idea of future directions and important points. So I would still take a look at those, but they're not included in one of these slides. And then unsolved problems with the cochlear implant being used on slide 36. And basically the consequences speech, he again talks about another feedback loop where he talks about going to like, I think an orphanage in China. And then he talks to the kids, and then they all have cochlear implants, and he's very surprised at first as to like how they speak. And that's because the feedback loop has that vocal error based on the cochlear implant. Amazing. So make sure you study today.
Thanks, Steve. Just gonna talk. Oh yeah.
I bet you would accept $200 in cash to give me an A. I bet if you were to contact me, I would be willing to pay. No, I'm joking. I saw the email.
But yeah, I think also like one thing and also he talked about like this weird way of encoding like individually. There's like I think why do you like why
But they insist that he's not because left America.
Yeah, because you feel like you base everything off of
Oh, I see. How do they come?
I mean, what does it mean?
I think that's like it's take the office, but I can't like smart
That's true, but like I genuinely think that the last thing is, these are like most of the shortened because they don't think how many. Like all the guys in the what? It's like, now my friend's speaking from high school.
Yeah, since they're not the bulk, they didn't cover any lectures after exam 2. It'll be on the previous stuff. But I'll also try to upload these, scan these in tomorrow, and put them on Blackboard. Because I can't cover everything today. Alright, so first thing I'm gonna just talk about real quick is, so we have from Zhang, we talked about essentially perceptrons and multi-layer perceptrons and deep neural networks. And so essentially they're all of this form where Wi is some weight and G is some function on the input. So the main thing you need to know for this class, I think, is just when G is the identity versus when G is not. So there's this like classical problem of the XOR. I don't know. So basically, two cases when G of X is just the input variables, you can't solve this problem because it's not linearly separable. You can't draw a line essentially, and when G of X is non-linear, you can do it. And so I would probably try to just memorize all the main functions that he presented. And then on the second midterm, I think probably like half the people missed this question. So I would just memorize the pseudo inverse. I know I'm not gonna drive it again, but I would just know what this is and just know the formula because basically for that question I just graded if you got it or not, and half the people got it, half the people didn't. Alright.
Do you just write out?
Yeah, I'll write it out. And a good way to check if this is true or not. Yeah. Now, this is just a good way to check. So, the reason that the pseudo inverse is able to be written is because you can't invert A itself, but you can invert A transpose times A because it's a square matrix. So, if you're like really confused, just write out A pseudo inverse times the inverse of A pseudo inverse, and so you'll have A pseudo inverse, which is this term, and then this term, which is the inverse of it, which you essentially just flip flop when you take an inverse. And I posted some linear algebra review for people that have some issues with this. So if you guys, there's just like some quick linear algebra rules that you might need to know for the class.
What question did everyone miss?
Sorry?
What was the question that everyone missed?
Oh, write down the best linear optimal mapping, or the best linear unbiased estimator. Yeah. And so I'll just memorize the form of it. So for the Winslow stuff, yeah.
This is a left inverse, and I think on one side you get the right inverse.
For this one?
Yeah, there's a left inverse, which is one goes, and on one side goes to the right inverse. For some specific case. And there's more.
Yeah, okay, so this,
Where are you from?
so there's two cases, you flip them, so there's basically one where it's underdetermined. And over. So this is just when one of the matrices is like this versus like this. And so, honestly, for the purpose of this class, I don't think you need to know both. I think you just need to know one. This, one of them is just the transpose of the other. Yeah. So,
This one's using.
overdetermined.
Overdetermined?
Yeah. Okay, so for the Winslow part, just a couple quick reminders on midterm 1. There was some confusion about terms like these, so. Yeah, so lambda and tau, these are dimensionless constants, so they're space and time constants. So in general, like Alright, so we have that the electroatomic length is basically this dimensionless term that's defined by the actual length, which you can think of in meters, and the space constant, which is also in meters. So there's a question, and it'd just be good for everyone to review that conceptually, if you're given a number L, sorry,
So the units of the space constant and dimensional constant are meters?
no, sorry, electrotonic length is dimensions. The space constant has. So basically, if you're given L is equal to 0.5, all that tells you is that what L is equal to 2 lambda, or the other way around. So essentially, your length is half of the space constant. So if you guys remember from maybe in SP Lab, you guys did it. Any sort of space and time constants, essentially when you're going your rise time. So if you're, say, charging something, you need to, the space constant or the time constant represents at what point in time or space it reaches 63% of the value. So those are just some good key ideas to remember. So I think I can't like solve all these problems, but there's some classical problems in cable theory that I think are important that you guys can just, they're all done in class. So alright, so one is if you're given a finite cable, essentially just solving for like z of x. And if you guys have any trouble with these, just try to, we can talk about it on the calendar hopefully. You guys have a good one. Another good example to practice is a situation like this. And so the key thing here to remember is so this is essentially a compartmental model when you have splitting branches. And so if you have splitting branches, you can essentially, the way to tackle these problems is to basically just commit to memory the the 3/2 power law. And that's a way to basically combine all these sort of parallel branches into one branch. Oh yeah, and then this is like a compartmental model. The wall. I don't know, he calls it like a bunch of different things. It's basically called 3/2 power law. Yeah, it's basically a way to combine the cables when they have a diameter that follows a certain equation. So that is never. You guys didn't do this? Even in the lecture? Because it was in the Oh. Yeah, I know, it was in the lecture, so I'm just like writing it down. I mean, you guys, if you guys don't want to know it, it's fine, but. That I can't comment. Let's just say I'm putting up a subset of things that I find relevant. Yeah. Like, I can't say everything's relevant, or else that'd be a little bit unfair. But I try to put up the things that, oh yeah, and then I would also know how to solve problems like this, where you have a series of models. So this contains take on different forms depending on what sort of assumptions you make. So it's come up as a model for well, like spine, dendritic spines-ish, as well as this phenomenon called shunting inhibition. So I would just know like sort of some concepts behind them. I can't like solve this would take like at least 20 minutes, so I don't remember for that. Oh yeah.
For that second part where you did the 3/2 law,
Yeah.
what? So now you have that like key value that you got. What do you do with that?
Okay, so basically this just becomes one cable with a diameter d2. So that's the only difference. Everything else is combined. Yeah. The only thing is now that you have essentially a circuit model that's in series versus a circuit model that's branching. Yeah.
Do they have to be the same length?
Do they have to be the same length? Yeah, they have to be the same length. I mean, I think it'd be pretty unfeasible to give you guys something with differing lengths, because that would take like a super long time. You would normally have to do this computationally if you had to solve it. But a simple way to like save time would be for you to essentially. Yeah.
And do they also have to have the same like space constant?
Have the same space constant. Yeah, I mean if they have they have the same essentially cable parameters, which will give you the lambda in the same length, you'll have the same essentially lambda constant. So the space constant is a function of essentially like the resistance along the membrane, the resistance along the axial cable. So, a couple of concepts to remember, I think. So I think some of the main concepts behind a Hopfield network, essentially, it's one, fully recurrent, two, robust against noise in the input, and three, it learns through Hebbian learning. So in Zhang, they covered a bunch of concepts, one of the big ones being Hebbian learning. So, I mean, I think that's pretty, I guess, self-explanatory, but I would be aware of other different kinds of learning. So we talked about the multi-layer perceptron earlier, so that's trained through generally supervised learning. So I would just know sort of like, if you're not familiar with the framework, how that's done. So yeah, you essentially just feed in class labels and you do gradient descent. I think that's like the main concept behind there. Yeah, I guess some people miss the gradient descent question, so. Yeah, real quick. So, basically, to do gradient descent, you always want to define an error function, a loss function, so that, like, I'll just break it down to like the main steps, I think, and if you write those, you're good to go, I think. Second, yeah, you literally just take a gradient, so remember that gradient with respect to the weights, because we take gradient with respect to weights, so because we want to change the weights accordingly. And so our model, the reason we do that is because our model for y hat is we have some model where g is, you can think of this as linear or nonlinear. Either way, the concept is the same. When you take the gradient with respect to the weights, you're going to chain rule that, essentially. Is anyone confused about that? So a couple things to remember, because I know this might be simple for some people, but when you have that g prime is greater than 0, or g prime is less than 0, they essentially tell you different things. And so one is telling you that if the g prime is greater than 0, that means that this function is always increasing if it's strictly greater than 0. So just essentially telling you that if you take the derivative of this function, it's always positive, so the slope is always pointing up, right? Vice versa for a negative. And so that's why, so that was on the second term. And then, so besides supervised learning, there's also...
Just on the second term, was the answer just that g prime is 0? Did I have to prove it?
I mean, originally I said yes, but then not a lot of people did that, so I basically remade the rubric. or else everyone would have messed that up. I mean, I think like it's not asking you to prove anything. It's just like knowing the concepts behind it. Like you should know that when a derivative is greater than 0, what it physically means. You know, like you don't derive anything. I mean, it's nice if you did. Oh yeah, so there's Hebbian learning, there's supervised learning. I would just be aware of the other types of learning. So supervised, I'll just do it. So, unsupervised. I don't think he really covered this, did he? There's also reinforcement. So unsupervised, I don't think we really talked about this. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. Is it Hebbian? Hebbian is, it's kind of a form of unsupervised. Yeah, I would say it's unsupervised, but it's not a one-to-one mapping because Hebbian, you still have like, you're seeing something, you're not learning it by like, your neurons firing together, right? But yeah, I guess I would classify it as unsupervised. That probably wouldn't be a real question, I'd say. But yeah, unsupervised, you generally have to like assume some model of your data, like probability or linear systems wise. And we didn't really talk about that. I think reinforcement, I think the main connect in this class is with respect to biology. So I think knowing what like the reward signal, I think we talked about dopamine, right? So knowing where dopamine is produced in the brain, and the fact that dopamine is essentially the reward signal in humans, such that we kind of built reinforcement learning algorithms that kind of do similar things, like learning from rewards, and dopamine is our biological analog. Guess I won't get into the chat. Alright. I think that's all. Because I do some derivations on here that I can post online. That would probably be easier for you guys to follow on your own rather than me writing it. Is there any questions regarding to like?
Oh yeah, so just like relating back to the test.
Sorry, I can't.
Oh, just like relating back to the test. They're like the question where they asked like the optimal, like the best estimator, which was like the pseudo inverse, right?
Yeah.
Then the other question I think was about like the optimal mapping from like x to like wx or wx to x, and like I don't know, like what did we like come to the conclusion about with like the identity versus like actually having something?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that problem. Yeah, so when we do the pseudo inverse there, we're assuming something along the lines of like AX kind of, right? Or I think in the midterm it was like what? Oh yeah, it was Y equals AX. And then the other situation was X equals like AX kind of, right? But you have to figure out what this A form is. So the problem is X, the reason you can't write identity is because that's not what you're doing essentially. Like that's just incorrect. Because you're still trying to essentially map the inputs of X to itself, right? So you want to estimate the, like essentially some weight matrix that does this optimally in a linear sense. So essentially all you're doing is, doing the pseudo inverse again. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on like posting our exams? Like the ones that we already took?
We can't do that because Xiaoqing will not let us.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
We can ask Dr. Wong.
Yeah, but I don't know. We already did. I
Oh,
mean,
you
I
did?
can. Here,
You
I'll ask
did.
again.
Okay.
I can throw an email in if you want.
Yeah, I'll ask again, but I wouldn't get your hopes up on that just because it's like department policy mainly.
Yeah.
Not really like any of our decisions.
If not, what's another exam you can do or something?
Sorry, what?
If like you can't post them on Blackboard, can you do like another exam viewing?
For the final, you mean? Or just
Like,
for the midterms?
For the midterms.
Yeah, so Z's having all stars tomorrow. I'll try to like ask the other TAs if we can have like just some time where like they're doing work in Clark to open up that room that we store exams. But at the very minimum, I'll make sure Z has them in Clark. Yeah.
Thanks.
You good? Yeah.
Yeah, so far we have to know
Can you readjust this? Can you readjust this when I?
Yeah. I'll do that right now. Do you need the slides?
I'll need slides.
Say people.
we just like get real close to base.
I'm not
Proponents look more at maps and their games, so I feel like he's the one.
I'm pretty sure that's optional. So there's a lot of optional material. That's definitely Oh, no.
Great.
Like I feel like well, I would just look at the orientation, like, determine where you're going to feel like it's, pretty obvious. Oh yeah, no, everything will be for the whole system. You have a limited amount of time to how to optimize. Yeah, exactly. That's why I still suggest different things to hold on.
Yeah, there's like a way.
More.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll cover Dr. Cullen's material. Feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions. If I don't see you, just shout out. Yeah. Okay, let's get started. So what Dr. Cullen basically starts off with, what his 4 of the lectures are on, is sort of eye movements. And so you have sort of 6 muscles that control eye movements. So you should know what those 6 muscles are. The lateral, they're basically the ones that are listed, the extraocular muscles. Ocular basically just means eye, so that's an important term for you to know. So you have extraocular muscles controlling eye movements. You have voluntary eye movements and involuntary eye movements. Dr. Cullen's material focuses more on involuntary eye movements. Within that, you have the vestibulo-ocular reflex, or the VOR. The vestibular system basically just, one of the senses, it basically detects proprioception, so where you are in space, so like 3D motion. And so vestibulo-ocular reflex basically is a reflex that allows you to detect movement of your own body and then adjust the eye movements accordingly so that you're able to stabilize your gaze. And so an example of that would be texting while you're walking down the street. So while you're walking, your head is moving, your body's moving, and somehow or the other your eyes are still being able to focus in on the text that you're reading. The reason you're able to do that is because your body is compensating for that head motion. And it's able to do that through the VOR, the vestibulo-ocular reflex. She does mention another reflex, which is the optokinetic reflex, which is basically the reflex that if you're sort of in a stationary train and the train that's next to you is moving, you feel that you're moving. So that's the optokinetic reflex. It's really not that important for her section. I focus on understanding the VOR, because that's what she tries to mathematically model. And so in order to model the VOR, we'll first model the oculomotor plant, so ocular eye motor muscles, eye muscles. So how do eye muscles, how does eye movement take place? So the oculomotor plant, and then we'll model the vestibular system, and then pull that in together for the vestibulo-ocular reflex. So to get started, let's mathematically model the oculomotor plant. So how do we have eye movements? So we have a certain XT, which is basically the motor neuron drive input, and we have certain YT, which is basically, so that's the eye movement output. So what we're trying to figure out is what is the transfer function that allows this firing to somehow translate into eye movements. And to develop a model for that, we basically have this viscoelastic model of eye movement where you have 3 important terms. The first is F is equal to KL, wherein K is basically the spring constant that represents eye muscle forces. So because you're looking at eye muscles, you wanna use some spring constant to account for the eye muscles movement, and then you have this coefficient. So F is equal to R dl dt, where L is basically the eye position, and so for relating viscosity of that eye for relating velocity of that eye movement, you want to take into account the viscosity coefficient of the orbital tissues, the drag of the orbital tissues. So how much do they oppose that movement? Question.
Yeah, so in the questions that were posted online, there doesn't seem to be, I didn't look too closely, but there doesn't seem to be like any mathematical questions. Should we expect?
They don't ask us to compute stuff.
Okay.
You definitely don't need to compute stuff, but you want to understand what's happening in these models and what the terms represent. Yeah. And then the third one is, the third term that you need to know is mass of the eye, which is basically how you account for acceleration of the eye movement. And so you put that together, you get your model for the eye movement, and then they tested the model experimentally and found that there was no dependence on the mass of the eye, so you don't really need that third term. And so you're only gonna, you basically, for your final model, the viscoelastic final model of the eye movement, you only need the two terms with the spring constant and with the viscosity coefficient question.
Just two questions. So on the previous slide, when you said motor neuron drive is like the input, is that the same thing as like modeling the strength, or are they just modeling it in this case as well? Like,
So here, motor neuron drive input is basically firing. So firing is somehow, you have some sort of nerves that are firing at the eye muscles, which then translates into movement. So therefore the actual eye movement to take place. And so in order to find the S, you want to take into account the actual mass of the eye, because that would play a role in how the eye would actually move. You want to take into account the orbital tissues surrounding the eye, and you want to take into account the actual, so the spring constant of the muscles themselves. Does that make sense?
in this case, like, I guess if the mass doesn't matter, I guess it doesn't make a difference, but like the spring and then the other, like the derivative one, they're like in parallel with each other, and the mass is kind of in series with that, but then we just add all of them together.
Yeah, you're right. That doesn't entirely make sense, but I would just go with it. It's just a matter of how that's just given you, and if that's how they represent it. I would just go with that. Yeah. You really just have to know what the viscoelastic model that they propose. You just need to know what the terms in that are, how it works. You don't necessarily need more than that. Yeah. Okay, so experimentally, they were found that there was no dependence on the mass of the eye. They also looked at sort of firing rate, and they had a very similar equation where where basically E is the eye position, and then we also have some sort of baseline firing, and then we have some increased firing with the spring constant. Sorry, no, that's not the spring constant. That's just a constant. So that's just 5 spikes per seconds per degree. That's just a constant. K is just a constant. R is just a constant. The idea here is that what you find is that the firing rate is sort of the model for the firing rate is very similar to the model for your eye movement right here, which basically just shows that firing rate is proportional, is linearly related to the eye movement. And the important thing to note here is that the time constant of the eye movement from the model was found to be 200 milliseconds in response to step input. And the reason that's kind of problematic is that if your model is telling you that an eye movement takes 200 milliseconds, but in actuality it takes shorter, then you need to somehow account for that, which is what we'll do next question.
So there's one of the questions on the back that's talks about the ocular integrator, or the neural integrator, and about the time constant for a step input.
Right.
Even though a saccade is actually quicker than 200 milliseconds, would this just be that, given that you're not assuming a burst if only a step input?
I don't think I entirely understand your question. So basically the idea here is that because the actual saccade takes shorter, it takes like 50 milliseconds and not 200 milliseconds, we adjust our model. And so we assume that there isn't just a step input, there's a pulse input plus a step input.
Right, but assuming, so like the question specifically asks you about the response to the neural integrator to a step input.
Yeah.
If that is the case, then is this just the time constant?
This would be the time constant if you didn't have the integrator. So if you were to lesion your nucleus prepositus, which is the integrator, if you were to just lesion that, then instead of having a 50 millisecond saccade, you would have a 200 millisecond saccade. So you need the integrator to reduce the time constant.
But doesn't the integrator take the step, like take any pulse and use it? If it was like a unit step input or a pulse input? The first step is
Okay, let's move forward, and maybe if you have questions after I talk through this slide, we can get to it. Okay, so essentially, now we know that the model says, okay, 200 milliseconds is the time constant for a saccade, which is basically an eye movement. How do we account for the fact that in actuality, it's supposed to, a saccade should only take 50 milliseconds? And so to do that, you basically say, okay, well, I don't just have a step input then. I have, in actuality, I might be having sort of a pulse input. So we say that there are burst cells, which basically have some burst of activity, which is denoted here as pulse input, which then essentially goes into what we call our oculomotor integrator, or the nucleus prepositus, and that integrates the pulse input to basically form a step input, and that's basically what drives the motor neurons. And so that's how we essentially modify our model to better fit the time constant that we see physiologically. And so important things to know here is that the pulse command that's sent, the reason that it's helpful is because it helps overcome the viscous drag and initiate the saccade, whereas the step command then maintains the saccade because you have this continued firing. That's continued. And so now talking through what you would expect in these different parts of these different cortical regions. So what you would have here is that you would have burst neurons, which have some burst of activity, the pulse input, which helps overcome that initial viscous drag. And then you have your tonic integrator, the nucleus prepositus, which fires continuously to overcome the elastic restoring forces, so it helps maintain your saccade. And then you also have these things called pause neurons. So pause neurons essentially want fixation. And so when you want to make a saccade, you're making some kind of movement, so you don't want fixation in that moment. So while you're making a saccade, you want to suppress your pause neurons. So that's essentially what we see on this graph right here, wherein while you're trying to make a saccade, so that's the eye movement, you have a lot of burst of activity. You have tonic integrator activity, which just continues on and helps maintain the saccade. And then you have pause neurons, which, because they like fixation, you want to suppress them for a bit while you're making the eye movement, and then afterwards, once you've decided on the new position, you want your pause neurons to start firing again so that you can now fixate at the new position. And then obviously you have your motor neuron firing. So that's basically what this graph is denoting right here.
What happens during the downward slope period?
So the downward slope of this graph is not entirely consistent with what you've learned about the model. So my recommendation on that is to just ignore what's happening on this part. Just focus on what's happening here, because that's what you'll be tested on. You will not be tested on the knowledge of what's happening here. And that it'll just be very confusing to try and fit this into more units. Yeah. This is like the advice that we also got last year when we asked that question. Yeah. Yeah, the question.
How does the integrator take the burst or the pulse and make it into a step essentially?
So basically you just have the pulse going into the nucleus prepositus, and it's like a positive feedback loop, which just keeps adding the pulse input, so it keeps maintaining it.
But like eventually
Yeah, so you essentially have some burst of activity going straight to the motor neurons, which helps overcome the initial viscous drag. And then you also have that sort of signal from the burst neurons going into the nucleus prepositus, which just keeps maintaining that signal and sending it constantly to the motor neuron, and helps maintain that saccade.
So it's like a continuous loop.
Yeah. And so this diagram right here is basically just the same diagram as this one, only that over here we've added the pause neurons, and we know that the pause neurons are controlled by the rostral end of the superior nucleus. So I would just know what's happening in this diagram right here, with this integrator being the nucleus prepositus. Also, the burst neurons can be denoted as BN or as BT. So over here it's BT, over here it's BN. Not sure why they decided to change that, but just make note of that so you don't get confused. It's the same thing. Okay, So next, now that we've talked about the ocular motor, we've developed a model for it. We've seen experimentally what parts of that model are important. We've seen the time constant, and we've tried to somehow account for that time constant, try to make it more physiologically relevant. Now we're going to talk solely about the vestibular system, and we're going to develop a model for the vestibular system. So some physiology behind understanding what the vestibular system does, how it does it. So you're detecting 3D motion, so your own self-motion. And the reason you're able to do that is because you have three semicircular canals on both sides of your head. So it's basically a bilaterally symmetric system. And so you have three orthogonal canals, which basically detect 3D rotational motion. When your head moves, there's endolymph, which is basically a very viscous, honey-like fluid inside these semicircular canals. So you have that fluid in there, extremely viscous. So when you're moving, your semicircular canals move with you, but because the fluid is very viscous, it doesn't move. And so essentially, the semicircular canal moves in relative to the fluid. And so that's how you're detecting your 3D motion. So the fluid itself is highly viscous and therefore stays stationary. You also have the utricle and the saccule, which basically detect 2D linear velocity, with utricle being in the horizontal plane and saccule for the vertical plane. You don't need to know more about the utricle and saccule than that. Okay, so now we'll talk about how exactly the vestibular organs are able to detect that. So you have, this is just basically a cross-section of the semicircular canal. So you have this empty cavity, which has the endolymph in it, and over here you have the cupula, which has sort of hair cells. Well, not yeah, they are hair cells. So it has hair cells on it, which have stereocilia on them. So very similar to how the auditory system worked, where you had hair cells with stereocilia, which were sort of mechanically, as a result of the movement of the fluid, they moved and they depolarized. So you have the same sort of setup here, wherein the hair cells are depolarized as a result of the movement of your cupula. And so you have, so essentially, when you're moving, the frequency at which you're moving determines the kind of signal you encode from your vestibular system. And so what we see here is that if you're moving at natural stimulus frequencies, which is 0.05 to 20 hertz, the system will encode velocity, and that's called phase 0 by definition. If you were to move at much lower frequencies, the system acts as an accelerometer, so you're encoding for acceleration. That's phase minus 90. So relating these two diagrams, so low frequency range, phase minus 90, you're encoding acceleration. If you were going at super high frequencies, so high frequency range, that's phase 90, you encode actual position. And the reason that makes sense is because if you were going very fast, your endolymph essentially has had no time to catch up with the movement of the semicircular canal. So you're able to detect exactly what position you moved, so what was the new position of the head, because your endolymph stayed stationary. As opposed to that, if you were moving at a very low frequency, your endolymph movement might be able to catch up with the movement of your semicircular canal. And so you assume that, okay, the endolymph is being able to catch up with the movement of the semicircular canal, then it's acting as an accelerometer. And so that's basically what this sort of slide here is showing, that the frequency at which you're moving determines the kind of signal the vestibular system is going to be able to encode. And so now, to develop some form of a model of the vestibular system, we basically have a very similar setup as the ocular motor plant, where we have this apportionment pendulum model of the semicircular canal. We have we're taking into account three things here. The first is the elasticity of the cupula. So earlier we were looking at the spring constant of the eye muscles. We're now I'm trying to draw an analogy between the two models. In this model, we're now looking at the elasticity of the cupula. And just to remind you, the cupula is basically that region of the semicircular canals which contains the hair cells on it. And the hair cells are the ones that detect that motion. And then you also have for sort of velocity of the endolymph displacement, you also have that being related to the viscous drag of the canal wall. So earlier we were looking at sort of the viscosity coefficient for the orbital tissues drag, but now we're looking at the canal wall drag. So how much does that oppose the movement of the endolymph? And then the third thing that we're looking at here is the moment of inertia of the endolymph. So earlier we were looking at the mass of the eye, but over here we're looking at the moment of inertia. So really it's just the same model. The idea is just in that we were looking at eye movement. Over here we're looking at endolymph displacement. And the essential parameters are, the meaning behind the parameters are changing, but the parameters themselves are pretty much the same.
On the slide before, there's an arrow for the pupil or whatever that points to the left, but the movement is also to the left. So I was wondering why it wouldn't like diffract back to the right.
So if you were moving in a certain direction, so you're moving to the right, relative to that, the endolymph is moving to the left.
Oh, okay. I thought the top arrow was the like the counterclockwise arrow.
So this is.
Right, so answer head
Yeah.
I see where your confusion is. So this is the skull is moving that way. This is the relative endolymph movement is that way.
But then the small one, like right above the little pink thing, is going
Yeah.
to the left.
I see why you're confused, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. Okay, yeah, it's not that important. Okay, any questions on the torsion pendulum model? I hope you guys understand the analogy that exists between the torsion pendulum model and the oculomotor plant. Okay, so basically in her slides, she uses symbols instead of using ER and I, she uses these symbols. The reason I just presented with this is so that you can see the analogy between the torsion pendulum model, the semicircular canals, and the viscoelastic model of the oculomotor plant. But the idea here is the same. So whether you use these symbols or you use these symbols, it doesn't matter as long as you do it. So whatever's easiest for you guys. Okay. And so now, same as before, we had this model. We looked at it experimentally to see whether all three parameters are important. Earlier in the lower plan, we found that the mass of the eye was not important. However, for this model, we find that all of the three parameters are important. So basically, this is your final model for torsion pendulum model. Like this is the model that you determine as the final model. And so because it is a second order differential, you would have two time constants. And so those time constants were experimentally found to be 5 seconds and 4 milliseconds. And the reason, again, that's problematic. So again, drawing an analogy between that first model of the eye movement and this model, in that you found a model, you looked at it experimentally, and then you found the time constants, and the time constants just don't match up with what happens in real life. So you somehow try and account for that. And so that's exactly what we're doing again here, wherein once we find that the time constant here is 5 seconds and 4 milliseconds, we say, okay, well, but the time constant for a vestibular ocular reflex is 20 seconds. So how do we now account for that? So to do that, we basically say, okay, we'll develop this model where you have head motion, and the head motion goes into the vestibular system, which goes to the vestibular nuclei. CVD is not that important, it's just abducens. But the idea is just that head motion is somehow translated to eye movement. The reason that it takes 20 milliseconds and not like 5 seconds for VOR to take 20 seconds and not 5 seconds for the VOR to take place is because this sort of head motion is also sent to the nodulus and the uvula of the cerebellum. So you just need to remember that. Just remember the terminology. The important thing here is basically just that in this case, we also have an integrator. And so the integrator here for this plant is the nodulus and the uvula of the cerebellum, which basically elongates the signal. And so VOR essentially just takes 20 seconds instead of just taking 5 seconds. And so these graphs right here basically just show that, yes, VOR is taking a lot longer than the actual vestibular firing. And so you have certain head velocity, that's the input that goes in from the vestibular system. And then you have vestibular afferent firing rate. If you compare that with the vestibular nuclei neuron firing rate, you see that there's a much more shallow curve for the vestibular nuclei. And so what that shows is that the time constant is longer. And that makes sense because VOR takes a lot longer than the model that we developed for the vestibular firing. And then you just have eye velocity. And so basically the idea is, again, in both models, we developed equations, we tested the equations, we found the time constants, we saw time constants don't match with what happens physiologically, and so how do we account for that? In both scenarios, we use some form of an integrator to account for that. And so that's kind of the analogy between the two models that you need to remember. And yeah, definitely know what these diagrams are and what's happening in them. Okay, so then that's the two models. We now have a model for the vestibular system, we have a model for the oculomotor gland. Now we talk a little bit about the physiology of the firing from the vestibular system. So we talked about the semicircular canals and the endolymph and the cupula with the hair cells, but what are the cupula and the hair cells actually connected to? So they're connected to afferents. So again, afferents being sort of the neurons that are sending signals to the brain, so are writing signals. And so you have two types of afferents. You have the irregular afferents, vestibular afferents, and the regular vestibular afferents. As you can see, the regular vestibular afferents are sort of across different trials. And so essentially in this experiment you have a monkey that's moving, so there's some form of head velocity. This is essentially the signal. So this is our input. And we're just looking at what the firing looks like of the regular afferents versus the irregular afferents. So the main difference that you see here is that across multiple trials, the regular afferents are a lot more consistent. So there's a lot more trial-to-trial reliability as opposed to with the irregular afferents, wherein for each trial we sort of get a very different response. We also see that overall in the actual firing rate, if we were to plot that, we see that there's sort of less, overall just less firing in the regular afferents than there is in the irregular afferents. And so you essentially have a higher gain in the irregular afferents than you do in the regular afferents. And then another important thing to note is that because you have sort of this very consistent pattern, you're able to also have better discriminability and pattern discernment in the regular as opposed to the irregular afferents. Question?
The little caption underneath that picture says the regular afferents displays the lowest amount of variability. I thought you had just said the opposite.
Let me double check on that.
Sorry,
Maybe
so-
there's a mistake.
I think what that is just that the irregular ones is really precise spike timing.
Right.
But there's less variability in the sense that it's harder to reconstruct the original signal from the irregular afferents than you can from the regular ones.
Right. That comes on to the next slide, definitely. Like you can see over here, essentially you're overlaying the irregular afferent firing onto the actual signal, and you see that it maps the actual signal better than the irregular afferents do. So you essentially have better pattern discernment for the regular afferents than you do for the irregular afferents. So I assume that that's essentially what that's referring to. Question?
Type 1 is afferent.
So you have type 1 is irregular and type 2 is regular.
I thought there was just like inner and outer.
Well, that was for the auditory system. So this is for the vestibular system. Yes.
Oh, what does this specifically mean when it says it carries more information? Like, what metric is that?
Where does it say that?
Under the higher gains, lower information for irregular.
Are you talking about this?
Yes, I think it was on the previous slide as well. On the second bullet point, in the first block.
With lower information. Okay, so basically the idea is just here that, so the irregular afferents basically function as event detectors. So when you have some form of head velocity change, they just fire a lot. And so because they also have a higher gain, they fire a lot more than the regular afferents do. And so there's sort of lower information in terms of pattern discernibility. So when you move to the next slide, you'll see that with the irregular afferents, yes, they're firing a lot in response to the signal, but they don't necessarily map the signal. So you don't get as much information from that, other than the fact that yes, there was an input, there was a signal. So it functions as an event detector. That's essentially all that is. Okay. And then anything else? So basically, with the regular afferents, you also see just less noise and less discharge. I would definitely know this slide and this diagram. Yes.
Could you just go back to that slide for like 20 seconds so I can write these down? I think I always do this.
Oh, I'll post these.
Oh, okay, that works too.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
What's the like advantage of having the irregular afferent?
The advantage of having the irregular afferents is that they function as event detectors. So they have a higher gain. And so if you were to have some kind of head velocity,
We're going to cover basically everything we talked about. Okay, so I'm going to go fast because there's a lot and you're tired. Okay. Okay, so we talked about cost and rewards. We talked about how cost and rewards actually influence our behavior. This was a good graph that actually told you how cost and rewards influence our behavior. For example, when they gave the person the 100, the plus 100, if you click in the circle, you'll get $100. They would click most of the circle. Add the minus 200 circle to that, their behavior shifts, obviously, because you don't want to lose money. And if it's minus 500, then the center of where you're aiming shifts even more towards the right. So that's what the first graph is demonstrating. The second graph is just saying, what if you had increased variance? Like, what if you were working with a shaky pen or something? Then you would even aim further to the right because you want to avoid the losing point area. That's just what this slide is telling you. Cost and rewards influence our behavior, and we want to see how. Okay, so he did this example of the mouse. The important thing here is that if you're associating rewards with a location, with a particular location, that happens in the hippocampus. Whereas if you are associating the value with a certain object, like the green one, like the green podcast or something, then that's happening in basal ganglia. Dopamine. So dopamine is something that Dr. John also covered. This is for reinforcement learning. But what does it do? It basically predicts how much reward you're going to get. So let's say in the first case, where you're just surprised, like probability that a stimulus actually predicts that you're going to get a reward is 0, which means I might ring a bell and then I might give you food or not. There is no correlation between the stimulus and actually receiving an reward. In that case, you see the dopamine is only after I give you the reward because you get excited. Yeah. But as the probability increases, you see that as soon as the stimulus is on for a probability of 1, you get all the excitement because you know for sure that the reward is coming. But when the reward is actually coming, then the dopamine doesn't really need to signal anything. So what dopamine signals is the expected reward, not the actual. He talked about this inner model, so you have the motor command that goes through your body, but then you have this forward model inside you that actually predicts the sensory consequences, which then feeds back to the motor command. So you've seen this model times in various contexts. Okay, so what is the importance of a forward model? One, for motor control, it happens in the cerebellum. So when you have someone whose cerebellum is damaged, they cannot predict the consequences of their, to control their motor action. And this is seen in this ball example. So that's the diseased patient on the right-hand side, and the healthy patient on the left-hand side. And you see that they respond just fine to sensory information. This is not predicting yet. This is me dropping the ball. You have no idea when I'm dropping the ball, but when I do it, you increase the force when you sense it. So sensory information is perfectly fine with someone who has a cerebellum damage, but prediction response is messed up because of the fact that they cannot predict, they don't have that forward model. So if you are dropping the ball for yourself and if you have cerebellum damage, you cannot predict the response. So you can see that in healthy subjects, you already start increasing the force where before the ball actually makes the impact, whereas the patient only shows the response to the sensory information. Moving on, second lecture. You should be familiar with this diagram and the division of spinal cord and what each, more or less what each part corresponds to. Not gonna go over it, it's memorization. You should also, you saw this I think on your second exam, that how spinal cord injuries damage your neurons, the few steps that are associated with that. How the I have a good flow diagram. Here we go. So, when there is a damage, there could be hemorrhaging, and if you have hemorrhaging, then you have the cyst, and the cyst pressures the neighbors. The pressuring of the neighbors leads to two things. One, you don't get nutrient and oxygen to your other cells, and those cells die. Another thing is the demyelination. Myelin helps your neurons to fire faster. Demyelination impedes communication. And yeah. Another part is that the damage causes the injured neurons to release glutamate, which overexcites your healthy neurons, which kills them. Another thing is that it kills neighbor glia cells, and it forms that ball of cells. Don't worry, it's all posted right there in the blue black one. So we have different types of muscles, as you learned in math. There is type of muscles which are slow, but they fatigue very slowly. And then there's the type 2, which have the fast fatiguing one and the slow fatiguing one. And then you should know the definition of a motor unit, which is a motor neuron and all the fibers it's connecting to. In polio, you know that some of the motors that some of the muscles that the motor neuron is connecting, some of the motor neurons die, so the motor neurons need to cover a larger area so they connect to more muscle fibers. You should know what an intrafusal fiber is. So one thing, between the tendon and the extrafusal muscle, you have the Golgi. The Golgi tendon tells you information about the force. So how much force a certain muscle is generating. And that's sent back to your central nervous system. So that's in this loop down here. You get the force information from the Golgi. And then you get the length or the velocity information from the spindles. So the spindle afferents are the ones that are connected on the right-hand side. And then there is a gamma motor neuron which feeds to the intrafusal muscle fibers. These gamma neurons control how sensitive your spindle afferents are. So they change the length, which changes the sensitivity of your spindle afferents force to detecting the length. And yeah, those all feed to the alpha neurons. Alpha neurons feed into your muscles, which then causes your muscles to contract. You're familiar with this? I won't cover it. You want me to cover it? Show this equation. Left hemisphere. You should have an idea of how the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere coordinate, and how the left hemisphere has some control over the ipsilateral or ipsilateral being on the same side, but it has more control on the contralateral, meaning the left hemisphere mostly controls your right-hand side of the body. It definitely has, basically no control on the hand muscles of its own side. So, okay, so here we look at PPC neurons. So PPC neurons in parietal lobe, if you actually damage it, it codes for reaching with respect to eye position, not body position, which means that if you change your body position, but your eye position didn't change, that's not coded by the PPC. PPC also includes both the target location and the eye location. They're sensitive to head location, head position, because they are sensitive with the eye position, to the eye position. So over here, you see that both the hand position and the target position are changing in that example, but the PPC neurons don't show too much of a change in activity, and that's because in the fixation center coordinates, it's only showing the relative difference. It's coding the relative difference between the target and the hand position. So, okay, so this is regarding the reaching. I think we're up to like 5 now. Okay, so over here we have the same forward loop as we did before. The two things that feed into this is one, your hand location, and then the target locations in fixation coordinates, which means relative position. So PPC neurons don't actually depend on what you see. So you can actually have a certain cue and then just make it disappear. Like it could be a light, but then it disappears. But the PPC neurons you can see over here, the cue is cut off, but the PPC is still active. So it's not really dependent on what you see, but rather what you know that certain target is and you want to make the motion to. And then it includes reward value of the visual stimuli. For example, on the right-hand side is a certain cue that is actually valuable to the monkey. So you see high activity in the second and third of part A for the PPC, but for B it's a value less. It's something that the monkey doesn't care about, and you see no activity in the PPC. So it encodes value, not just the object. It encodes the value of the visual stimuli. Okay, another thing over here you see as the rewards amount gets higher, your PPC gets more active. So that's the top graph. The bottom graph is that the probability of getting a reward is getting higher. And again, as you have higher probability of receiving an award, your PPC activity also increases. Now, the monkey should be able to associate the reward with actually making the reaching action. So if you increase the delay between when you give the monkey the reward and when it's actually doing the whole action for you, if you increase the delay, they start not associating that together anymore. Therefore, you see at that 12 seconds, it's basically it's a horizontal line. But at 0 seconds, there is an association, so there is PPC action. Oh, okay. PPC only depends on what you're actually going, like it includes the value, but not the actual load or force that it needs to do to get to that value. So you can see that if there was opposing load or no load or assisting load, the PPC activity didn't really change. You shouldn't. Mirror neurons, there was a discussion on that, but basically they fire similarly when you are doing the action for the monkey. So if you can record from mirror neurons in the monkey, if you are doing the action or if the monkey is doing the action, their activity is similar. That's the entire point of mirror neurons. Okay, so if you have a lesion in the right side of your hemisphere and you ask the patient to draw these images, you can see that they draw the right side but not the left side. And if you have neglect patients and tell them to look straight ahead, they're going to be deviated a lot. But if you give them those prism glasses that shifts the way that, so for example, with prism glasses, it shifts the way that light is coming in. so your direction of like seeing is shifted, you see that you can fix the problem in the neglect patients. But if you do that to the same healthy patients, then it shifts their view and they straight is this way. And what's cool about this is that the effect lasts for a while, so it's not just while they were wearing the glasses, but rather it stayed for a few hours a day. Okay, so lecture 6. PPC. The thing that we so far covered that it does is that it codes for the target position, it codes for the hand position, and it assigns value to the stimuli that you see. Now, in this lecture, he's going to show you that the premotor cortex kind of subtracts the target position and the hand position and codes for that, so like what's the desired movement. And then the primary motor cortex is going to translate that, oh, what's the desired movement to actual muscle activity to sensory motor commands. So that can be seen in the schematic over here. You see the PPC is coding for location of your hand and location of the target, whereas the premotor cortex is doing the difference and where your arm is, and the motor cortex finally gets the motor command that's given. So I think this was a true false on your exam, and I might be wrong, but so this was the monkey, and in this entire experiment that he showed that it's the location with respect to your hand position and not the fixation that the premotor cortex codes for. So it's with respect to hand position, and so in the first 3 experiments, you see that the hand position is identical and the fixation point, so where the monkey is looking, changes, but the activity of the neuron doesn't change. Whereas in the last experiment, the monkey used their hand, and you see that the activity of the neuron in that circle changes. So that's what premotor cortex codes for, the location of the. Okay. So premotor cortex wants to give you the desired movement. So it subtracts your target location from your hand position. So that's not very sensitive to forces because it's only giving the difference. So it's giving the desired movement. It doesn't care about forces just yet. So that's what this experiment is showing you. Whereas for primary cortex, now that needs to give you the actual command for moving your hand. So it needs to give the final command for moving the arm. So that actually does code for how much force is needed. So that's what this is. And another evidence that premotor cortex happens before the primary motor cortex is this, which is the premotor cortex fires before the primary motor cortex. So that's what's shown here. And then over here we have someone who's lost their leg, and he talks a little bit about the pain, so like the phantom pain. And it turns out that if you have a patient who has lost their leg, a very effective thing to do is to give them a mirror so that they feel like they have the leg, and that soothes the pain because their motor cortex, although they've lost a limb, their motor cortex is still adjusting to that new mapping. So it might fire and that might cause pain. So this helps, especially if done properly. Oh. That's
Thank you.
going over like some of the
Oh, like Dal Raspberry maybe? Okay.
like all the stuff you guys did. If I go I'm gonna like briefly mention some of the stuff from planning from the exams. So nothing new.
When can we expect the slides to be realistically posted?
That would be a question for Q&A's last time.
I will just quickly go through FMI stuff, the economics, and some of the about the electricity. I think this part is not that hard, but something just to remember. And for the functional MRI, the basic things to know is that there are three types of three components of the MRI scanner. We have the big magnet outside, which will generate the static magnetic field, which we call it zero field. That field will help you align all the protons in your body so that all the protons essentially point to the same direction. And then we have the radio transmitters. We also call it the radiant coil. This coil is to transmit all these radio frequency powers to your body. And then it can excite all the protons in your body, especially the protons in the waters. And then we also have the radio receiver. The receiver essentially just receive all the radio frequency powers from the protons back because we have already excited them, and then they will rotate in the magnetic field, and then it will come back. So this emission of the radio frequency power will be received by the radio receiver. So these three components, I guess you need to know what they are and what does they work, like how does it work. So this is essentially how the MRI itself works. We know that the magnetic field, we will use the Tesla law to denote how strong the magnetic field is. And usually we will have a 3 Tesla or 1.5 Tesla for the normal MRI scanner. And in this variation of magnetic field, we will see this phenomenon that without this magnetic field, all the protons in our body will just go random directions. But when you have a magnetic field, all the protons will be allowed together to be the same direction of the P0 field. And then because of this trial condition, you will be able to do the excitation. So for the excitation, it means that the radio transmitter in the radiant coil, it will give your protons a radio frequency energy, and then this energy will excite your the proton direction from the P0 direction to a XY plane. So the P0 is the Z direction, and then it will excite your protons to the XY plane. And then at the XY plane, it will try to spin around and to rotate. We will have two sort of relaxation time that is can be different for different tissue properties. And this is how the spin goes after it got excited. So after the spin has been excited and rotated to the XY plane,
there are two things they will do. First, that it will try to go back to the z direction. So for the z direction, the z component, there will be an increase or decrease of the z component, and the time constant is the t1. The other one is the decay of the signal in the xy plane, the xy direction. So that one, the time constant will be t2. So the T1 and T2 is not just the relaxation time, it will also be different for different tissue components. So when you try to image something, how this T1 and T2 property will help you to generate the contrast. So basically, when you want to image your brain, you will see that the T1 and T2 weighted images is different because one matter in your brain, they will have different T1 and T2 properties. So for example, in the T1 image, you will see that the gray matter is dark, and the white matter is sort of more brighter. But in the T2 image, it's opposite, which means that the gray matter is lighter and the white matter is dark. So this is just how the structure MRI works. And then he talks about the functional MRI. So functional MRI is not just to analyze the brain structure. It will not only give you the structure information of the brain, but also to study the function of the brain. Like, for example, if I give you a signal, and then which part of the brain is excited and which part of the brain is connected with which other part of the brain. So the basic thing about the functional MRI is that we have the neurons in our brain, and when we have a stimuli, the neuron will try to fire, but the firing of the neuron will need energy. So how do we supply our brain this energy by the blood flow? And you can see that when your blood flow goes into the brain, it will supply more energy or more oxygen than actually needed. So you will have more oxygenated hemoglobin in your brain, and then you will have this hemodynamic response, which means that when you try to stimulate something in your brain, then your brain area actually are excited, and then you will see that those area will have more oxygen and will have more oxygen, and then it will generate more signal in the MRI, and we call that signal to be blood oxygen level dependent Bode signal. So the Bode signal is the basic thing about functional MRI. So essentially, functional MRI will try to measure the neural activity indirectly via the vascular effect, not measure the neural activity itself, but measure the vascular component, the Bode signal. Yeah, so this is just another way to explain this. The Bode signal means that when there is synaptic firing, the transmission, it will release the glutamate. The glutamate will cause an increase in the blood flow, which tells your brain, tells your body that I need more oxygen. This will cause the concentration of. Yeah, question.
4 slides ago, the bottom, like from your description of T1, it seems like the image on the bottom right might be T1. Even though it's labeled as T2, I'm obviously don't know.
Wait,
further back on this one, is that in the bottom right? Is that like what T1 is? It's labeled as T2.
Yeah, that one should be T1.
So
yeah, it's not T1. The recovery should be T1.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you.
Wait, so recovery is T1?
Yeah, the recovery along the z direction is T1, and the decay along the xy plane is T2. Alright, back to the Bode signal. So the Bode signal essentially is this increase in the blood flow will cause an increase in the concentration of the oxygenated hemoglobin, because your blood flow increases and it supplies a lot of oxygen here, and then it will so this increase in the oxygenated hemoglobin will be detected by the MRI scanner, so it will reflect the increase in the neural activity. So how does this Bode signal actually look like? If I just give you a very simple stimulus, and then you will see a Bode signal, or we call it hemodynamic response like this. So you will first have an initial dip, which means that at this time the blood flow has not come yet, so you have to sort of need a lot of oxygen, so you have an initial dip or decrease in the Bode signal, and then there will be a lot of blood flow comes inside. You will have a positive of the Bode signal, and then finally you will have a post-stimulus positive part is what we normally will try to, image will try to detect. So one thing about fMRI is that the temporal resolution is actually limited by your blood flow, because we know that the neuron actually fires at a very fast rate, but your blood flow is a continuous process. It cannot give you this discrete process. So when you actually do an experiment, you will see that the temporal resolution is limited by the blood flow, which is around 7 seconds, not in the millisecond state. So, for example, when I try to do a experiment, I want to give two stimulus, and then if I do these two stimulus too close to each other, then it is hard to separate these two response with only one peak there. So you have to sort of have enough interval between the two stimulus. So the important aspect of the Bose signal essentially is that the Bose signal is based on the blood flow, so the temporal resolution is limited by the precision of the blood flow. And also the spatial resolution of the functional MRI is limited by the MRI scanner itself. For example, there is the strength of the magnetic field, and also all this hardware stuff, the gradient coil will have the limitation of the spatial resolution. But normally we will do a 1 or 2 millimeter resolution. And also it cannot get an absolute measure of the neural activity or the metabolism. It is a relative measurement to see whether there is a activation or not compared with the other area of the brain or compared with your resting state without the stimulus. So this is just a typical experimental design of the fMRI. As you can see, normally we will do a block design without any, so first it will be a black screen, and you just ask the participant to look at that cross, and then we will have a stimulus like a picture, and after that we will go back to the dark screen again. And then for each box, so we will be able to get a time course of the Bose signal. And what we will do is that we will analyze those time course to see if it is different from other region of the brain, and or if it is different from your resting state. We can do a lot of statistical analysis, such as the t-test or the cross correlation. And what he talks about in class is the general linear model. So essentially, the general linear model is that we have a y, which is the time course of the Bose signal for a certain voxel, and then we have the axis. This x is a lot of things that can sort of give an explanation to see why you have this difference or why you have this demand in the time course of the signal. For example, the x can be your experimental design, like the block design 0, 1, 0, 1, things like that. Or this x can also be some other information, such as the age of the subject or the environmental stimulus. All this kind of thing can be included in this model. What this model will do, or what the statistical analysis will do, is that if the beta is significantly different than 0, if it is, then it means that this, if we have this x will have a direct effect on y. So when we do this analysis, you will be able to see which, like for example, which area is activated or not. So this one simply is just a experiment. For example, in this experiment, I will have two stimulus. One is this intact apple, and the other one is just a scrambled object, and then I will put them into a block design. So I will have the y is for fMRI signal, and then you have the design matrix. You have two x. One is the scrambled, the images. You have this block thing, and then the other one is the intact. So you put this design matrix into your equation and to see whether beta is 0 or not. You will also have the residuals, which is like an intercept. one thing about integrating the fMRI data is that, for example, if it's the reverse inference, for example, I find an area that, let's say we find an area of Y and it is activated by a certain task we call X. And then we also know that Y is involved in the mental process called Z, like during some other experiment. And then can I say that X can invoke the process D? So the answer is no, we cannot say that because this is what we call reverse inference. Although Y can have effect on both Z and X, it does not mean that X and Z have a relationship or not. It might be just what have this Y can be activated by both processes. It is not that task specific. So if you really want to test whether X evokes Z or not, you have to see whether there are certain voxels in the Y area or Y region that can be activated during the same process, and correlation test the two time course to see if there is actually a X evoked in the same process. Great. The other part is the neuroeconomics. Yeah, this part is, I'll go through very quickly. So the neuroeconomic essentially is how your brain evaluates the motivation when you are presented a incentive and to see how our performance is. So previously people think that with more incentive you will perform better because you are rewarded more. But actually there is another model saying that when you have more incentive, the performance actually going low because this is something we call it choking under pressure. At large incentive, high incentive, you are essentially feeling that you perform worse, you will lose something. So this will give you a worse performance. There will be more pressure. So we can use the functional MRI method to test whether which part of the brain is responsible for this problem. Something is called the ventral striatum. This is the neural interface between your motivation and the activation and your action. So the ventral striatum is somewhere in your basal brain, like the nucleus accumbens and the ventral putamen. So how does this area works like during different experimental design, and how does it actually connect your motivation and your action? So what he did is that a simple experiment, like during this experiment, you will give the subject a certain incentive that give him a reward that if you did this task, I will give you $50. And then you will be presented the motor task. After the motor task, you will be presented the result, whether you win something or you lose. For this one, there is no punishment in this. And then we will look at the behavior performance. And it shows that if during the easy task, which means that the area that you have to reach to is pretty large, so the task itself is easy, you will see that as large incentive, there is actually better performance. But when there is hard scenario, then at large incentive, you will see that the performance is actually going down. So it means that the choking under pressure will often happen during the hard scenario. So in this study, they will just use this generating a model to see which part of how does this different set of the experiment, whether the presentation of the incentive or the motor task itself has the effect on the ventral striatum. So the result shows different activation pattern during the incentive presentation and the motor task in the ventral striatum. So with more incentive, the incentive presentation process will excite the ventral striatum more and will see more signal. However, during the motor task with more incentive, the activation or the signal channel is actually lower. So it means that the motor task is something that has to be responsible for the choking under pressure phenomenon. So this one essentially is the same. Yes. So So the first result from this experiment is that the electric drive deactivation remains equipment. The other one is that the activation of the electric drive during the motor task is related to someone's loss aversion. So the loss aversion is essentially an index for the people to see like how he feels the loss, how he hates the loss. So the higher the loss aversion is, he will be more like sort of under pressure during the high speed. It means so this result just shows that the signal change or the activity of your mental striatum during the motor task is clearly related to your loss aversion. And then finally is that loss aversion can be predictive of your behavior performance. So the higher the loss aversion is, at a certain incentive, your performance is actually worse because you have low pressure. This. I will just do this but if you have time, you can take a look at the real framework, but I don't think that's too important here. So the final thing I want to talk about is the neuroplasticity, which is tested before, but still has several points here. So the neuroplasticity simply means that your synapses can grow and can lost at different terms of your brain. And we have the short-term plasticity, which is around milliseconds per second, but we also have this long-term plasticity, which will last a minute or more. That is the one that is important in the memory encoding. So the plasticity has several properties, and we call it the long-term potentiation, which means that when you have a synapses and after a certain large stimulus, the next time when you stimulate the synapses, it will give you a large response. And the long-term potentiation is input specific. Also, you have this cognitivity, which means that if you give more small stimulus rather than large stimulus, it can also give you this long-term. It can also trigger the long-term potentiation. Also, the long-term potentiation, the LTP, is also associated, which means that I have two stimulus. One is strong, and the other one is kind of weak. For example, let's say this dog with the food and the bell ringing. And the food is the strong stimulus, the training food is the weak one. But if you can sort of pair them together after a certain time, when you just do this weak stimulus, this training food, you can still see the salivation in the dog, which means that the weak stimulus shares the synapses with this strong stimulus, and this is the associativity of the LTP. So for certain synapse, we will have this presynaptic and the postsynaptic membrane. When there is calcium signal goes into the presynaptic dendrite, you will see the transport to the synaptic cleft, and then it will release the glutamate or other neurotransmitters, and those glutamate will bind to the receptor at the postsynaptic density, and then it will generate the action potential. So there are different kinds of glutamate receptors at the postsynaptic membranes. The most two important one is the NMDA and the AMPA. So the NMDA one is important for the initiation of the long-term potentiation, but the AMPA is for the maintenance of the LTP. So the mechanism of LTP will be can have three possibilities. One is that during the LTP there might be increased release. The second one will be that your response is actually increased, and the third one is both. So the widely established model is this silent synapse model. So this means that when there is only small there is only NMDA receptor on the membrane, and it will not generate strong firing rate or action potential. However, after a large stimulus, you will have the NMDA receptor open, and it will cause a cascade of events at the postsynaptic membrane, and then you will have the insertion of the AMP receptor, and this insertion calcium influx can also trigger both LTP and LTD, and it is determined by how high your concentration of calcium is. The higher, and at certain level, it can trigger either LTP and LTD. And some basic rule of synaptic plasticity is the time dependence. So, for example, I have a synapse between A and B neuron, and if A fire first and B fire later, and then this will give you a LTP. But if B fire first and A fire later, then it will depress the synapses, which will give you a LTD. So there are several explanations of this time dependence of the synapses. So also, I think all of them are related to the calcium concentration in your synapses, and then this calcium difference will, as I said before, it will trigger either LTP or the LTD. So the other thing about the plasticity is the metaplasticity, which means that not only this LTP and LTD thing works, but also your neural itself, your brain itself will also try to regulate your plasticity. So the experiment that are most important here is this Saucher experiment, which means that we have and it has a binocular vision. So when you present a certain stimulus to this cat, both neurons in the two eyes will fire. But if you suture one of, like you close one of the eyes, and after a certain time you open this eyes, you will find that when you present a stimulus, and then only the right eye, the open eye, will fire a strong action potential, but not the left eye. And this one can be easily explained by the LTP, because it just means that you are not using something, and then the synapses will decrease or will be reduced, and you will have less action potential here. But the other thing about this experiment is the reverse Saucher experiment, which means that if you first close your left eye, and then after a certain time close the right eye, but open the left eye, and then you try to open two eyes, and you will see that the right eye firing rate is reduced, but the left eye firing rate is coming back. It's not that slow, so which means that there can be other mechanisms, not just the single LTP can explain, and we call it metaplasticity, including two things. One is the sliding threshold, and the other one is the synaptic scaling. So the sliding threshold just means that when you have this, it means your brain regulates your synapses. It can slide the threshold to either larger one or slower one, depending on the environment or depending on the history. And for example, that one, for the left eye, essentially the threshold is going lower so that you will have more firing rate. Yeah, that's it. The other one is the synaptic scaling, which means that you can have the different firing rate will increase or decrease the synaptic drive to your synapses. So you will either increase or decrease the synaptic response. So these two are the metaplasticities that can sort of explain why the Saucher experiment works during the reverse Saucher. Yeah, I think that's it. This two It's not. It's just
Sorry, it's been a long day. So I was supposed to go over Dr. Wong's stuff and Connor stuff from like past exams. I don't have time to do that, and I'm sure you all have to get going. So either we could end now, or I could just mention all their content.
Can you have like slides slides you can post for us or?
I have no slides now. I was gonna write stuff.
Is there any like important stuff?
Honor. Alright, let's see what we got. Visual system, Snowed image info, which is distributed, implicit, and stable, and visual cortex, to compress the data, make it explicit and more stable, know the different cells in the retina, on center versus off center cells, how it uses those to compress edge information, pathway of information to V1. Like V1 is kind of exhibiting orientation tuning, V4 is curvature tuning, configuration coding, similarity coding. That's cover stuff.
If we go through like 30 slides from the first 10.
Yeah. Yep. And they'll just have a very simple. And for Dr. Wang, no. Psychophysics, the different, absolute thresholds, which is the detection tasks, and then relative, which is the discrimination tasks. Signal detection theory, RSE curves, receptive fields, spike train measurements, which is like refiring rate, vestibular histogram, interspike interval histograms, period histograms. He also did the auditory system briefly, so cochlea stuff. You guys remember that? That was really like good stuff. Phase locking. Is there anything else? Might be everything for past exams anyway. Yeah. So go over that stuff. Yeah. Song? I think he did give us an exam question. Honestly, I don't know that.
Dude loves chromatic scales.
Any other questions? Your exam's on Saturday?
How are you
I'm getting through the weeks. Yeah. Like 3 final projects, 2 exams. Alright, well, good luck on your exams, guys. Sorry this went so late.
No, I gave that to her as her birthday present.
Send an email to the and that's how we initiate the